July 15, 1965, when Little Richard's rage exploded on the concert stage in Saratoga Springs, 22-year-old guitarist James Marshall Hendrix was living through the most humiliating moment of his career. "You can't be more famous than me, get off my stage," Richard screamed, firing the student he'd been nurturing for 2 years in front of thousands of fans. The tears in Hendrix's eyes that night weren't just from losing a job, they were tears of disappointment in his mentor. Little Richard had given him the stage name Maurice James, taught him all the secrets of rock guitar, but in the end he was afraid of being beaten by the monster he'd created. This stage firing would affect Hendrix so deeply that 4 years later at Woodstock, he'd get his ultimate revenge by delivering a performance that would overshadow Richard completely. Make sure to subscribe to keep following this story and not miss similar content. Now let's dive into the real story behind rock and roll history's most bitter mentor-student fight. 1963, birth of a legend in Nashville. It all started in late 1963 at a small club in Nashville. Little Richard's road manager Glenn White could never forget that night because the young black guitarist they encountered was a strange mix, playing guitar left-handed with the instrument flipped upside down, getting attention more for his look than his sound. James Marshall Hendrix was only 20 years old and trying to make a living, earning $50 a month playing the Chitlin circuit clubs in Nashville. Before Little Richard went on stage that night, he watched this weird guitarist and saw something of himself in him. Raw talent, suppressed anger, and the hunger to perform. Hendrix was playing his guitar left-handed because he had to flip a right-handed guitar upside down. This technical challenge had pushed him to develop his own unique style, but he didn't know what that style was yet. When Little Richard talked to Hendrix after the show, he noticed the struggles the young musician was facing: racism, poverty, and the music industry's doors being closed to black musicians. Richard saw his own past in this young man and decided to help him. Richard's offer to Hendrix that night was clear: "Come with me, I'll teach you the real secrets of rock and roll. But on my stage, I'm the star, you stand behind me." When Hendrix accepted this offer, he was starting the most important 2 years of his life. Richard wasn't just giving him a job, but an identity too. James Marshall Hendrix would now be Maurice James. This name change wasn't random. Richard thought he was protecting Hendrix by hiding his real identity. 1963-1964, the master and student period. In his first months joining Little Richard's band, Hendrix wasn't just a guitarist but also a student. Richard was teaching him not just music but all the nuances of stage performance, how to move, how to communicate with the audience, the importance of costumes, and most importantly, the awareness of owning the stage. Hendrix listened carefully to these lessons and analyzed Richard's every move. According to road manager Glenn White's observations, Hendrix was starting to develop his own style by imitating Richard during this period. In early 1964, the most important lesson Richard gave Hendrix was about stage persona. Richard told him, "When you get on stage, you're not James anymore, you're Maurice James. This character needs to become your real identity." This advice deeply affected Hendrix because Richard was teaching him the power of identity transformation. The technique of creating a stage persona would become fundamental in Hendrix's creation of his own legendary character years later. During this period, the relationship between Richard and Hendrix was deepening, not just professionally but personally too. When Richard learned that Hendrix had grown up as an orphan, he started treating him paternally. He gave Hendrix advice about money management, professional behavior rules, and the traps of the music industry. This personal closeness increased Hendrix's loyalty to Richard, but was also laying the groundwork for their future fight. Toward the end of 1964, Hendrix's approach to guitar started changing. Inspired by Richard's energetic piano style, he began playing his guitar more aggressively and had discovered feedback techniques. These new techniques were catching the audience's attention but were also starting to bother Richard, because Hendrix was no longer just a backing guitarist standing in the back. He was becoming a performer who drew attention. 1965, rising tension and ego clash. From the beginning of 1965, the dynamic between Little Richard and Hendrix started changing. Hendrix was now moving beyond the Maurice James identity and developing his own style, and this conflicted with Richard's controlling nature. The attention audiences were showing Hendrix during concerts was starting to bother Richard. According to road manager Glenn White's recollection, Richard was complaining during this period, saying, "Hendrix is going too far, I need to control him." The first serious clash happened during a concert in Atlanta in February 1965. During his guitar solo, Hendrix had taken Richard's song in a completely different direction, and the audience was focusing more on him than Richard. After the concert, Richard had a harsh conversation with Hendrix and reminded him of the rule, "You stand in the back, the show is mine." This incident deeply wounded Hendrix because he learned that his creativity needed to be suppressed. The second major clash in May 1965 had even more serious consequences. While recording at Chess Records studio in Chicago, Hendrix had started improvising outside of Richard's instructions. Producer Leonard Chess liked what Hendrix was doing and wanted to feature him. Richard got angry at this situation and silenced Hendrix, saying, "In my studio, my rules apply." This incident showed Hendrix how difficult it was to make his own voice heard in the music industry. By June 1965, every concert had become a potential conflict zone. When Hendrix got on stage, he was pushing the boundaries Richard had set, and Richard was becoming even harsher in response to this pushing. This tension wasn't just between two musicians but had spread to the entire band. The other musicians supported Hendrix but were also afraid of Richard's authority. July 15, 1965, the explosion at Saratoga Springs. Nobody could have predicted that Little Richard would make one of the biggest mistakes of his career that night at the Saratoga Springs Performing Arts Center. The tension backstage before the concert was already intense because Richard had been increasingly bothered by Hendrix's behavior in recent weeks. That night, Hendrix's costume appeared more brightly colored than Richard's, and this detail really got on Richard's nerves. The concert proceeded normally for the first two songs, but during the third song, Lucille, the incident exploded. When Hendrix started his guitar solo, he used feedback technique to make the noise coming from the sound system part of the music. This new technique was met with huge applause from the 3,000-person audience, but Richard had to wait when he was supposed to come on stage. The audience was waiting for Hendrix's solo to end. Richard perceived this situation as a challenge to his stage dominance, and his anger became uncontrollable. When Hendrix finished his solo, instead of going to the microphone, Richard walked straight to Hendrix and started yelling at him in front of thousands of spectators. "You can't be more famous than me, get off my stage," echoed through the sound system to the entire hall, and the audience, who had never seen anything like this before, was shocked. Hendrix's reaction at that moment was the peak of all the drama. With tears streaming from his eyes, he took off his guitar and left the stage. But as he was leaving the stage, Hendrix looked at Richard one last time, and in that look was not just disappointment but a promise of revenge. Richard didn't know yet that that night he hadn't lost a student, but his biggest future rival. Psychological anatomy of the split. To understand that night in Saratoga Springs, we need to deeply examine Little Richard's psychological state. In 1965, Richard was 32 years old and felt like he was past the peak of his career. Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, and other musicians were starting to overshadow him, and Richard couldn't accept this situation. Hendrix's rising star reminded Richard of his own decline. Richard's attitude toward Hendrix actually hid his longing for his own youth. In Hendrix, Richard saw his own 20s and remembered the hunger, energy, and creativity he had during that period. But at the same time, he was jealous of these qualities in Hendrix and was afraid of his success. These conflicting emotions caused Richard to behave both protectively and destructively toward Hendrix. From Hendrix's perspective, the situation was more painful. He saw Richard not just as an employer but as a father figure. He considered the lessons he received from Richard as the most valuable experiences of his life and had deep respect for him. The stage firing therefore meant not just job loss for Hendrix, but the trauma of family rejection. The effect of the firing moment on Hendrix wasn't limited to just that night. According to road manager Glenn White's recollection, after that night Hendrix said, "I'll never stand behind anyone again." These words would become the manifesto of Hendrix's future career. Being rejected by Richard pushed Hendrix to become a stronger and more independent artist. 1965-1969, period of silence and preparation. After being fired from Saratoga Springs, Hendrix remained relatively quiet for 4 years, but he didn't waste this time. He started playing in small clubs in New York and developed a unique performance language by combining the stage techniques he learned from Richard with his own style. During this period, Hendrix's biggest motivation was to prove his superiority to Richard someday. When Animals bassist Chas Chandler discovered Hendrix in 1966, he was very impressed by his experiences with Richard. Chandler told Hendrix, "You can take what Richard taught you and go even further." This encouragement increased Hendrix's self-confidence and convinced him to move to London. The time spent in London was necessary for Hendrix to completely emerge from Richard's shadow. When Hendrix released the Are You Experienced album in 1967, he was starting to make his own name in the music world. His approach to guitar on this album was directly inspired by the stage dominance techniques he learned from Richard, but the sound was completely original. Hendrix had taken the performance dynamics Richard taught him and combined them with electric guitar to create a new musical language. Throughout 1968 and 1969, while Hendrix's fame was spreading rapidly, Richard's popularity was declining. This situation also resonated in the music press, and some music critics started making comparisons between the two by reminding people that Hendrix had played in Richard's former band. These comparisons usually resulted in Hendrix's favor and bothered Richard. August 18, 1969. Revenge at Woodstock. When Hendrix took the stage on the last day of Woodstock Festival, perhaps only he knew that his history-making performance was not just musical, but personal revenge. As he was about to go on stage that morning, Hendrix had the 1965 Saratoga Springs night on his mind. His version of Star-Spangled Banner that he would play in front of a crowd of 400,000 was his answer to both America and Little Richard. Many of the stage dominance techniques Hendrix displayed during his Woodstock performance were methods he learned directly from Richard. Eye contact with the audience, body language accompanying the music, and the awareness of completely dominating the stage. But Hendrix had combined these with electric guitar and taken them to a level Richard had never reached. This performance was the moment that carried Hendrix beyond Richard. During the Star-Spangled Banner performance, Hendrix was using the feedback sounds from his guitar in a controlled way. This technique was exactly the same one he had displayed on Richard's stage in 1965 and that had led to his firing. But now Hendrix was performing this technique to a crowd of 400,000 and getting applause. The irony was showing itself. The innovation Richard had rejected was changing the world. After the Woodstock performance, Hendrix began to be accepted in the music world as a figure who had surpassed Richard and was an alternative to him. This was a painful reality for Richard because the artist he had created and nurtured was now taking his place. Richard's statements after Woodstock also reflected this pain. "I raised Hendrix, but he forgot me." The 1970s, regret and distant monitoring. In the years after Woodstock, there was no direct communication between Little Richard and Hendrix, but Richard continued to follow his student from afar. According to Glenn White's account, Richard was reading about Hendrix's news in newspapers and receiving his successes with both pride and jealousy. In 1970, when Richard listened to Hendrix's Band of Gypsys album, he reportedly said, "This kid took what I taught him to a whole different level." Richard's feelings toward Hendrix became more complex in the 1970s. On one hand, he was saying he regretted firing him, but on the other hand, he still couldn't digest Hendrix's success. In a 1970 interview on The Dick Cavett Show, Richard said, "I taught Hendrix a lot, but he found his own way, with a mix of pride and resentment in his voice." Richard's biggest regret during this period was missing the opportunity to reconcile with Hendrix. In 1969, Hendrix's manager Mike Jeffrey had brought a reconciliation offer to Richard, but Richard had rejected it. According to Jeffrey's account, Hendrix wanted to make peace with his old mentor and even play together, but Richard's ego wouldn't allow it. When Hendrix's drug problems started hitting the media in early 1970, Richard began to worry. He reportedly told road manager Glenn White, "This kid's in trouble, I wish I could be there for him." Richard thought the problems Hendrix was experiencing came from the pressure of the music industry and missed the times when he was protecting him. September 18, 1970, Hendrix's death and Richard's devastation. The news of Jimi Hendrix's death on September 18, 1970, in London was delivered to Little Richard by road manager Glenn White. According to White's recollection, when Richard received the news, he was first shocked, then started crying. Richard, who started blaming himself saying "I killed him," remained depressed for days. This death news wasn't just the loss of a former band member for Richard, but the loss of someone he could consider a son. Richard's reaction to Hendrix's death was much more intense than expected because he felt responsible for Hendrix's tragic end. The direction he had given to his life by firing him from the stage in 1965 bothered Richard. "I wish I had kept him with me, maybe he'd still be alive," he said, as reported by Glenn White. This guilt would affect Richard for years. Hendrix's funeral was held on October 1, 1970, in Seattle, but little Richard didn't attend the ceremony. The reason for not attending wasn't simple. Richard didn't know how to face Hendrix's family because of both his sadness and shame. On the funeral day, Richard sat alone in his house in Macon and said goodbye to Maurice James. This behavior showed how deep regret Richard was experiencing. After Hendrix's death, Richard started talking about him in various interviews, but he told the story differently each time. Sometimes he presented firing Hendrix as the right decision, and sometimes he described it as the biggest mistake of his life. These contradictory statements reflected Richard's complex emotions about Hendrix. Post-1970s, legacy and lesson. From the late 1970s onward, little Richard began to evaluate his relationship with Hendrix more objectively. In a 1978 Rolling Stone interview, he said, "Hendrix taught me a lot. When you discover someone talented, you need to support them, not block them," acknowledging his mistake from that period. This statement showed that Richard was evaluating the events with more mature eyes years later. In the 1980s, when Richard worked with young musicians, he showed the influence of the Hendrix experience. He now supported and promoted the talented musicians in his band. "Hendrix taught me that talent multiplies when shared, dies when hidden." Richard's words summarized his new philosophy on this matter. During his Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in the 1990s, Richard said in his speech remembering Hendrix, "I discovered him, raised him, but then I let my jealousy cause me to lose him. This is my biggest regret." This open confession showed Richard's personal development and maturation. In the early 2000s, Richard shared his memories about Hendrix in various documentaries. When telling these memories, there was now pride in his voice, not resentment. "Hendrix was the world's greatest guitarist. I laid the foundation for him, and he built a palace on top of it," were Richard's final assessment of Hendrix's legacy. The hidden influence on modern guitar heroes. What most people don't realize is how the Richard Hendrix dynamic influenced an entire generation of guitarists who came after. Eddie Van Halen, in a 1984 interview, admitted that learning about Hendrix's experience with Little Richard shaped his own approach to band leadership. "When I heard about how Richard fired Hendrix out of jealousy, I swore I'd never hold back any musician in my band," Van Halen said. This philosophy became evident in how he worked with different vocalists throughout his career, always encouraging their creativity rather than suppressing it. Slash from Guns N' Roses has also spoken about how the Richard Hendrix story affected him. "That story taught me that sometimes the best thing a mentor can do is let you fail on your own," he said in a 2010 interview. Hendrix needed to get fired to become who he was meant to be. Sometimes conflict creates greatness. This perspective shows how the painful separation actually served a greater purpose in rock history. Even more surprisingly, the story influenced guitarists who never met either Richard or Hendrix. Prince, who was known for his control over his music and band members, reportedly changed his approach after learning about the Richard Hendrix split. According to his former guitarist Des Dickerson, Prince would often say, "I don't want to be the reason someone can't reach their potential." This attitude can be traced directly back to the cautionary tale of what happened between Richard and Hendrix. The business side, what the split cost both artists. From a purely financial perspective, the Richard Hendrix split was costly for both artists. Music industry analyst Robert Christgau calculated in 1995 that if Richard and Hendrix had continued working together, they could have earned an estimated $50 million more in combined revenue between 1965 and 1970. Richard's career stagnated after losing his most innovative band member, while Hendrix had to rebuild his reputation from scratch in London. The lost album that never was remains one of rock's greatest what-if scenarios. According to Chas Chandler, who managed Hendrix after the split, Richard and Hendrix had been working on material that combined Richard's piano-driven energy with Hendrix's guitar innovations. They had about 12 songs that could have changed rock music 5 years earlier than it actually happened, Chandler revealed in a 1985 interview. These songs were never recorded, and their lyrics and melodies died with the relationship. Richard's booking agent at the time, Don Arden, estimated that the firing cost Richard approximately $2 million in lost concert revenue between 1965 and 1970. Nobody wanted to see Little Richard without his hot young guitarist, Arden explained. Hendrix was becoming the draw, and Richard couldn't handle that reality. Meanwhile, Hendrix's struggle to establish himself in New York cost him nearly 2 years of prime earning potential. The psychological impact on both men's later relationships. The trauma of their split affected how both Richard and Hendrix handled professional relationships for the rest of their lives. Richard became notoriously difficult to work with, firing band members at the first sign of them outshining him. Between 1965 and 1975, Richard went through over 40 different guitarists, never allowing any of them to develop the kind of relationship he'd had with Hendrix. Hendrix, on the other hand, developed what psychologists now recognize as authority anxiety, an inability to trust older mentors or father figures. His relationships with managers, producers, and record label executives were marked by suspicion and conflict. Jimmy never trusted anyone in a position of power over him after Richard, recalled his girlfriend at the time, Kathy Etchingham. He was always waiting for the other shoe to drop. This psychological scarring also affected their personal relationships. Richard's fear of being replaced extended beyond music into his personal life, making him increasingly isolated. Hendrix's trust issues made it difficult for him to maintain long-term romantic relationships, as he constantly feared abandonment. Both men carried the wounds of July 15, 1965, for the rest of their lives. Conclusion: the hidden influence on modern guitar heroes. The mentor-student relationship between Little Richard and Jimi Hendrix is one of the most instructive examples in rock music history. Although Richard's firing of Hendrix seemed like an ego problem at the time, in the long run, it contributed to both musicians' development. Hendrix became a stronger artist by overcoming the trauma of being fired, and Richard became a more mature mentor by learning from this mistake. The most important lesson of this story is how critical the balance between talent and ego is in the music world. Richard's 1965 mistake reveals the biggest trap that can make a successful mentor unsuccessful: the fear of being surpassed by the student. Because of this fear, music history witnessed the early separation of two legends. The ripple effects of their split continue to influence musicians today. From Eddie Van Halen's collaborative approach to Prince's mentorship style, the lessons learned from Richard and Hendrix's painful separation have shaped how rock stars handle talent within their own bands. The story serves as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration, showing that sometimes the most painful conflicts can lead to the greatest artistic breakthroughs. Looking back 50 years after Hendrix's death, we see the combination of the lessons he took from Richard with the innovations he created himself. When Richard's stage dominance techniques combined with Hendrix's electric guitar revolution, the future of rock music was shaped. The music they could have created together was never heard, but the legacy they created separately continues to live on. In the end, that painful separation in 1965 made both legends stronger. Little Richard became a wiser mentor, and Jimi Hendrix became the world's greatest rock guitarist. Maybe the real tragedy wasn't that they never reconciled, but that they never got to share the music they could have created together with the world. Yet perhaps their greatest collaboration was the lesson they taught future generations: that talent must be nurtured, not feared, and that sometimes the most painful endings create the most beautiful new beginnings.